we often cast ourselves as the lead character in our return stories. The fact is that we return to countries that have moved on in a way, and you have to just accept the fact that what you're longing for is really a state of mind rather than a physical place.
Hi, I'm Isabel Hogal, and this is Borderline. Today on the show, we have Kamal Al-Solaylee, who is a Canadian born in Yemen, a professor at the School of Journalism, Writing and Media at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. And he's here to talk to us about his third book, I believe, Return: Why We Go Back to Where We Come From. Thank you so much, Kamal, for joining.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Isabel.
So I have to say, when I came across your book by kind of weird internet rabbit holes, because unfortunately it's not in bookstores in the UK yet, I was really, really pleasantly surprised because it feels like it's a topic that we don't talk about very much, even though as an immigrant myself and knowing many immigrants, it's something that's always on your mind, the return.
Hmm.
But it's not part of the narrative. We talk a lot about immigration as a kind of a one-way ticket.
Hmm.
So what made you want to dive into this to address it?
I mean, in part, exactly because of what you said, is that we often talk about immigration as an outward immigration, and it's more or less has this kind of narrative: is that you leave a place of war or economic disadvantage, and you go to a better place, or you seek a better life somewhere else, or you escape torture or political persecution, and that narrative is just so overwhelming when we think about movement in general, the movement of people. And I've often felt that the return aspect of migration, the fact that migration is not just one directional, it has multi-directional. It's not just even return. Some people return and go back to their adopted country and they return again. But on a very personal basis is actually the book started. I started thinking about this book in 2015 when the war in Yemen started. And I started thinking about Yemen, where I was born in Aden, the south part of Aden. I think most of your British listeners will recognize it that as a former British colony. And I started thinking about the suffering that the people are experiencing there, my connection, including my family, most of whom still live there. And I just wanted to be, wanted to join them on some level, wanted to be there for them. And I started reconnecting with Arabic as a language, as a culture, things that I've sort of abandoned for the longest time in order to become the model westernized migrant. And I began to think about writing something along those lines of my own personal story, but I had already written a memoir. My first book was a memoir, and I thought, I just can't, like, I don't have it in me to write a full book personally. So instead, I turned it into a book of reported nonfiction where I looked at this whole concept of return philosophically in migration studies, which for the last 20 years it has gained some traction. But most of all, just talking about it as from different points of view of other people who have returned to their homeland and finding out what happens next. It's kind of almost like a movie when the credits end. There's a happy ending, and the credits end, and you don't know what happens next. We can if we talk about return at all, the story ends with these people returning to where they come from. But I was really curious to know. So, what happened to them? How are they faring in their country of origin or ancestral homeland? And that was the origin of the book.
Mhm. So who did you talk to? You traveled all over the world, and what did you hear from them?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I wanted to add a couple of more destinations, but COVID happened obviously in 2020, and I was lucky that the last reporting trip was in the sort of late summer of 2019. I went to the Basque region. I went to Belfast, Northern Ireland, Taiwan. I went to Israel and Palestine, to Ghana and Jamaica, and initially, I really wanted to focus on homelands that are, for lack of a better word, contested, where there are at least two or more people laying claim to it. So that's why I started in the Basque region, given the history of the Basque region in in relation to Spain, and then obviously Northern Ireland. And I was really curious about the situation between Taiwan and China, both in terms of individual returns, but also the bigger picture of China, um, sort of working very hard to reunite or to return Taiwan to the Chinese main part, to become part of the Chinese mainland, and obviously the mother of all return stories, which is Israel and Palestine. And then while I was reporting the book in 2019, I heard about the Year of Return in Ghana, and it was too good an opportunity not to not to go to Ghana, to Accra during the Year of Return and see how an entire nation can mobilize the concept of return, for political reason, but also for economic.
Yeah, it's like it was scheduled just for you that that year. Obviously, I guess for people who haven't heard about it, the Year of Return was it the 400-year anniversary
So it's
or
the 400-year anniversary of the first arrival of a slave ship to what is now the United States.
mm,
So it's 1619, which is
no.
again the 1619 project. And Ghana, what is now Ghana, features a number of ports from which the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, sort of made or ships made their way to the Caribbean and North America. So in an effort to kind of reclaim that anniversary instead of an anniversary around slavery, the government of Ghana and other governments in West Africa have tried in the past, but nobody on the scale of Ghana. It's sort of very clever. It's a very clever marketing strategy. Rebranded the year, instead of a year of exile, the year of return. And anyone who believes they can trace their origin to as a descendant of slavery, who's of an African descent, anywhere in the world can return to Ghana, and not necessarily to reside, but to explore, to connect with um, sort of Africa, the motherland, and also maybe to invest, which, as you can tell from the book, in both Northern Ireland and in Ghana, their return is big business. Return, it can bring back capital, foreign investments, ways of rejuvenating stagnant economies. So the thing that I find most, I wouldn't say puzzling, but the thing that I find most intriguing about returns is that it is such an emotional journey. Like when you said you're an immigrant, I'm an immigrant, and this connection to where we come from is so emotional, so deep, works on such an intrinsic, deep psychological level. And yet, for many countries or for many organizations, it is also a business opportunity or in many cases a political weapon. And so it's kind of it straddles all these things that are the emotional, that are very hard to talk about, to decipher, like how you get people to explain exactly what is it about the call of the homeland. And you'll see in the book that I talk to a lot of people, particularly in Jamaica, in places where I think, or Belfast, and particularly in Israel and Palestine, because in some cases, these are either war-torn countries with ongoing protracted conflicts, or just as in the case in Belfast, after 20 years of prosperity, really, for lack of a better word, the troubles is beginning to brew again after Brexit. And like, why would you want to return to a place where there's still violence? Jamaica, for example, the general level of violence, and try to get them to talk through these contradictions. That was probably the hardest part of the book, because you're talking to people and asking them to explain the inexplicable, the very subliminal, and not everyone can put that into words.
Mm. Because you really focused on diasporas and on people who have a relationship to home that I
Mm,
found really interesting, because I've experienced return personally, and that's where your book surprised me, because I think selfishly, when you kind of look for your own experiences, and
right,
actually it was completely different, because I never thought of myself as being part of a diaspora, and my reasons for leaving or for returning are
right.
not political. But here you talk to people who have this kind of very almost romanticized relationship to the homeland, including people who return. I don't even know if you can call it return, because they're several generations removed. And so their vision of
Yeah,
the homeland, the motherland, is can be a bit of a postcard,
Right.
and I wonder what they told you about how the reality of return kind of matched their imagined homeland.
Hmm. It varied. I mean, it varied from place to place. But I will give you an example from Ghana, for example. Two of the people I talked to are one Canadian and one American man, Kwame and Fule. Kwame is the American, Fule is the Canadian. And they're different generations. They're about 30 years apart, roughly. And they both really were tired of being black men in North America. They carried the weight of race and racism around them for 60 years, 33 years, and they feel reborn once they went back to once in Fule's case, he's actually born in Canada but two Ghanaian parents, so it's a very recent, like it's one generation away. But in Kwame's case, he had never been to Ghana until 2017, I believe, and that was he had always this dream of going back, visiting Africa. But after his initial visit, he felt that he has finally arrived, that he's finally in the place where he's meant to be, where he's learning to live again at the age of 63. When I spoke to him, so it had been a couple of years earlier, learning to live as a black man freely for the first time in his life, having grown up in near Oakland and Northern California, where even as a sort of successful middle class real estate agent, he has seen so much death and violence, and the experience carried the experience of racism with him, that to the point once he arrived in Ghana, it almost immediate he felt that this is where he needs to spend the rest of his life, even though he had never set foot in it. So that there is sort of one example from Ghana, but on the kind of the flip side of that is a number of younger men and women of Taiwanese background who for whom the connection to going back, the idea of going back to Taiwan has been kind of forced on them because they're the generation that entered the workforce right after around the financial crisis of 2008 2009. Places like Taiwan weathered that much better than Western economies. The going home is sort of in a way lacks that spiritual meaning, that journey to the homeland that you and I probably romanticize and think about. And there's a transactional element in their return. They're there because they can teach English and live very well on a relatively small salary that they make in Taipei, and it's an adventure. The young, it's an adventure, but they don't rule out going back to North America. Most all the characters I spoke in that chapter sort of have their roots in North America. So I find it incredibly rich and rewarding to talk to all these people whose return journeys vary to some extent, and that's just this. My way of saying it's not a monolithic narrative around return. It's as complex a story as immigration, and I believe that we need to talk about it as well for both for host countries like Canada and the US and Australia, the new world that quote unquote new world that takes in new immigrants, but also in terms of what does that say about immigration and global movement in general.
Hmm. I wonder if there's an hesitation to talk about it, because
Mm,
if as an immigrant you talk about wanting to return, maybe you're feeding into that narrative that you don't quite belong in your new
mm,
country, or you're
mm.
or people who dream of sending us back, quote unquote, or loving the hearing that and like, oh
Yes.
great, you feel like you belong better over there. Please go,
Yeah,
please.
yeah. No, I mean, this is why I chose that subtitle, while we go back to where we come from, because I wanted to reclaim that chant or that racist taunt, like go back to where you come from. I heard it, over the years, and I wanted to say that first of all, that it is my right to go back to where I come from if I want to, and I'm not like I am not. I don't see that as anything that is negative or implying defeat. And the big thing is that for the longest time, at least in my mind, I saw returns as a kind of a last resort, as a defeat. You immigrated, but you didn't really make it. Like if you talk about North America, for example, like you immigrated, but you weren't able to integrate properly, or you didn't. it wasn't the success story that you hope you'd be, so you go back and you retreat in a way to where you come from. But as I reported the book and as I started looking into return studies, which is a kind of a really burgeoning field within migration studies, it's actually I stand corrected. I think it is return comes with a lot of agency and control over your narrative, over your life story, of where it is right now and where we'd like it to be. Many of the people I spoke to, and that includes my own desire. They were thinking of their final resting place, like they're at the final stage is in life. Maybe they're in at retirement or past retirement. Worked for 30, 40 years in England, or the US or Canada, and they're thinking they're tired and they just want to go back, buy a home or buy a piece of land. Particularly, this is a story in Jamaica, and think about the third act of their lives. And I don't think that to me does not imply defeat, but to me it is the ultimate in agency, saying I'm going to go back to my homeland and it will have my remains when the time comes. I'm going to change the narrative of seeing the West as the ultimate destination where everybody should be and everybody should be happy because we have a much better standard of living. And I'm going to go back to, in many cases, a still developing country or countries that are ravaged by conflict or violence. And I'm going to reclaim that land, that culture that I turn my back on. I think that's a very powerful statement. And people who return, like they go through a very complex emotional journey, but they come out, in most cases, they come out of it the other end feeling that they have gained control of their lives.
Mm. In a way, it matches the way that our lives evolve. I think more and more we don't have lifelong jobs anymore. We don't
Hmm.
have lifelong careers and lifelong marriages. We have phases, right? More and more. Maybe it's the same with countries. We have phases, and things can end without failing.
Absolutely, Isabel. I mean, there's no reason to think that because you immigrated to, say, you came to Canada and or the U.S. and you've lived, part of the American dream or whatever. There is an older generation, and there's no reason for that to be all your story. I mean, there's still new acts to be written, and I think for me personally, I've been in Canada for 25 years and in England for 8 years prior to that. So I've been away from the Middle East and the part of the world I come from and my native tongue of Arabic for 33 years now. In fact, the older I get, the stronger the connection becomes, or the stronger the longing for it becomes. Now, listen, Isabel, I'm a gay man of a certain age. I am never going to be at home in the Middle East. Like, I know that for a fact. And yet I think my return fantasy or my return story has so many contradictions and so many irreconcilable elements, because how do I feel at home in part of the world that is still known for its homophobia, and more than homophobia, probably violence against gay men like myself. So there is nothing. Part of return is also incredibly irrational, and it doesn't always make sense on paper. But it's still the call. The call of the homeland is too powerful, and I tried to the best of my ability to resolve that conflict in the book.
Hmm. The challenge with return, it's something I've experienced probably on a smaller scale because I wasn't gone for 30 years, but I've moved away and returned home to France twice before.
Mhm.
And the thing is, when you go to live abroad, you break something. You don't realize it at the time,
Mhm.
but that sense of unconditional belonging somewhere, because you kind of adopt, the mores of wherever you go to,
Mhm.
and you're always going to be a foreigner where you go, but suddenly you kind of become a foreigner at home as well.
That's right.
Um, and
Did you
that's
feel,
that's a
did you feel that when you went back?
I
Which?
did. I
Mhm.
did, and I still do, and it's what made return really hard for me,
Mhm.
and what made me eventually leave again. And I'm curious if you've heard that from other from interviewees of yours, but
Yeah.
it's very hard to feel like a foreigner at home When you live abroad, you expect it.
Hmm.
But when you go home and you still don't belong, it's pretty painful.
It hurts. Yeah, no, I definitely heard that from several people. Some people from Jamaica in particular who have fantasized about return for a long time, went back and then found themselves sort of mired in the cycle of violence, and also they don't belong because they speak, American English or British English, and so they stand out even within. They may look like everyone else, but they stand out when as soon as they open their mouth, and they become sort of subject to exploitation, and everyone tries to everyone sees them as having coming back with money, and therefore they're sort of ripe for exploitation. And the way I look at it, I think it's like we often cast ourselves as the lead character in our return stories. The fact is that we return to countries that have moved on in a way. They've got on with their life. The language has changed. I talk in the book about how my Arabic seems to be stuck in 1970s, so sort of or 60s, even Arabic that is so dated. And then I was like the laughing stock of my nephew and niece when I tried to speak Arabic to them. They moved on with their lives. They have other concerns. They don't. You are not the center of their attention when you go home. I mean, the context has changed so much that you are no longer um, the focus of the story. In fact, you're just a supporting character now. And you have to just accept the fact that what you're longing for is really a state of mind rather than a physical place. The physical place has changed. You go back to Cairo, and it's not the Cairo that I grew up in at all. The population more or less doubled in 35 years or so. It's crowded. It is rough around, much more like rougher around the edges than I remember it as a child. And I think the Cairo that I was trying to reclaim is the Cairo of my childhood. Not only does it absolutely kind of not exist, but it probably wasn't that realistic to begin with. I over romanticized that childhood because I was a child or a young man, and I probably didn't see many of the things that my parents were worried about. Now I understand why my parents were always worried when you stayed out late as a young man in Cairo, because there is a violent street culture there. And but I didn't, being young and foolhardy, I never even noticed it. So I think the thing I would emphasize is that for a lot of returnees, they think they're going to go back to where they're going to pick up from where they left off, and they just don't understand that they're returning to, yes, the same country, but it's not the same culture or people, because you change and they've changed as well, and you expect them to stay exactly how you remember them.
Mm. So in a way, it's a nostalgia, and within the context of immigration, there is a physical place to return to, but it's almost not that different from someone who never left and just misses, what the country was in
Yes.
his or her adolescence. Or
I mean, that is at the heart of Trumpism, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, make America great again is about a nostalgia for an age in which America was probably predominantly white, economically much more vibrant, and so I mean, the weaponization of nostalgia is a big story. I don't actually go into it in great depth in the book, but what I do sort of mention is how that some countries uses that romanticization or that nostalgia very effectively to kind of connect the diaspora with the homeland. Maybe for emotional reasons, but mostly would be for political and economic reasons. Like you see the way I mean, I talk in the book about Northern Ireland and Belfast, the way Belfast is presented to the Irish diaspora as this sort of new place where tech and upstart, sort of digital economies are thriving, but it's also a good place to raise children. Your money goes a lot further in when you buy a house in a nice neighborhood, and your kids can walk to work safely, just like you did when you were a child. And that is in a way playing. It's a very manipulative narrative in many ways, and maybe true, but it plays on your sense of nostalgia of childhood, of a kind of a lost, more innocent time. Even if you grew up during the Troubles, because the Troubles have so far behind, like in terms of it's just so much time has passed that it's actually kind of almost ripe for historical revisionism in a way.
Mm. You mentioned Trump and nationalism. It's actually one part of the story that makes me uncomfortable, and I could tell from reading that it made you uncomfortable too, or is hard to reconcile in your mind.
Mm,
Is especially the chapter on the Basque country, and having grown up in France. When I hear of Basque nationalism, I think terrorism, which obviously is not all of it by any means. But it's interesting how a lot of these return diasporas rely on a form of national identity and
mm,
nationalism that we think of as almost quaint and romantic coming from these small powerless nations, but
mm,
it is the same dynamics that, you know, make nasty empires and Trump and Brexit and all that is that
mhm,
same idea of, because you were born somewhere, somehow you belong to it and you have a
mhm.
right to it, which is hard to reconcile with the more internationalist attitude of an immigrant.
Uh, I mean, exactly. In many ways, I mean, the Basque. I'm glad you mentioned the Basque region because given Spain's location as a whole and the waves of immigrants from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, the whole country, but particularly the Basque region, is kind of in a state of flux in terms of population demographic. And in the Basque region, and as I mentioned in the book, one of the leading parties' slogan is the homeland for the Basque, a homeland for everybody. And that I really wanted to investigate, is that true? Can someone who has absolutely no connection to the Basque ever feel like the Basque is their homeland when clearly the notion of a Basque homeland is rooted, has changed, has shifted over the years. It began with suggesting that it's a certain blood type that makes you a Basque, to a certain sort of connection to the land, like you have to have, as you said, you have to have been born there, to now just whether you speak Euskara or not, the Basque language or not, because anytime you try to connect national identity to a place of birth, or a certain geography, you run the risk of sort of the virulent form of nationalism, blood and soil. It's a far right language, and I would totally agree that returns sometimes, yes, they deploy a number of nationalist other slogans or strategies to invite people to come back. I mean, that's definitely the case in China. The idea of wooing the talents that are Chinese talents that are contributing to medical advancement and science in the West back to China in order to contribute to China's continuing rise to as a superpower. That's definitely a nationalist element there. However, I also argue that return can soften the edges of nationalism somehow, because you're coming in and out of the country with that had notions around like nationality, residence, citizen rights, and you're creating this subcategory of returnees who some of these governments want you for what you're offering back, and they have to give you concessions. They have to give you some voting rights. They have to give you some cultural training if you want your children to learn the language, whatever, for free. And in a way, because you go in and out of the borders, and you come back from another culture, you're already kind of undermining the single narrative of a nationalist political system. You're actually arguing that yes, I belong here, but I'm bringing with me ideas from my adopted country as well. So to me, I don't know if that theory holds, but I propose it in the book, and I just suggest that actually return can somehow soften the edges of naturalism, because people also return with a whole different set of ideas, including democracy and modernization, that sort of revises the way things have been done traditionally in their homeland.
Mm. Oh, you won't hear any argument from me on the value of that mixing and those ideas traveling
Right,
back and forth as
right.
people do, and sometimes also migrating to a third country and a fourth and a fifth. And
Hmm.
but it's interesting, with that idea of return and nationalism, who gets to wield that identity and that power of return? Because if you talk to a young Moroccan man, he is trying to cross the Gibraltar past, could just as much claim return, right? There were Arabic people in Spain for centuries, but that's not who gets to wield that narrative right now in Spain.
No, no, I think it, in many ways, that narrative is tied up with some notion of origin and skin color and Spanish ancestry. And yes, I don't think claiming that you're sixth, seventh generation Arab from Andalusia
Lucia or something, yeah.
or Seville or something will get you.
Mm,
Because in many ways, I guess this is, we go back to our previous question, is that the nationalist aspect of return, it is to bolster economies, it is to bolster a national identity, and there are categories of people whose return is more preferable to others. So in the Basque region, I talk about why the Basque people who, or descendant of Basque from Venezuela, were more welcomed in the Basque region, because historically they are seen as Basque, even though some of them have had absolutely no contact with Basque culture or language or the country itself, the autonomous region itself. But it's a historical connection that will not be taken away from them ever, and that's a privilege. That's a privilege. Whereas, as you mentioned, as someone who is of Moorish background would not be able to lay claim to the same identity.
mm. There's another category of unwanted returnees that we didn't talk about much. It's people who are deported, people who
Hmm.
are sent back, and whose migration story doesn't end on their own terms.
Hmm. Absolutely, and I mean, unfortunately, I was only able to cover that in relation to Jamaica, which is probably one of the countries in the world that takes the largest number of deportees. And the reason I was interested in that, because I really wanted to contrast the experience of people who choose to go back and people who are forced to go back. And obviously, the ultimate in being forced is to be deported, to be kicked out from one country. And what I found perhaps kind of perplexing about that is, even if they left Jamaica at a slightly older age, in their 20s, and they go back at their 60s, they have lost that connection to Jamaica. They have lost that connection. They're often counted among the homeless in Jamaica. Many of the people I spoke to were living in shelters because they have absolutely no, in some cases, no family. There's nobody to sort of look after them while they adapt back into life in Jamaica. And the thing that, like, you wouldn't get that in the text, but if I were to play you the audio of some of these interviews, these are American, British, like very strong British accents and inflected and phrases that are inflected with sort of British English. Or in some cases, these are people who grew up in the Bronx and New York, and they're as American as any other citizen of those cities. And now they go back to a country that's called Jamaica, and the only connection is that they were born there. And yeah, that's a whole different category of returns. And even within that, there are some who have managed to sort of rebuild their lives, and others who are truly the strangers in their homeland. Like, they are strangers in their homeland, and they still dream or are planning to return, as it were, to the countries that deported them.
Mm. I saw that when I was living in Cambodia. There was a wave of returns of um, so the US kind of applied this systematic deporting of young men who had been in prison. So they were, kind of kicked out of the country after serving their prison term. And so you had these young men who were from the Cambodian gangs in California who, had
Uh,
showed up in California when they were like 2 years old, don't know Khmer, and all of a sudden they're dumped at Phnom Penh airport. And, so there was a great donut shop that some American guy had opened, but it was problematic because essentially America was exporting its criminality, its
yes.
gangs back to
Hmm.
so-called countries of origin that had no part in turning these young men into criminals, and send them to Cambodia where they don't speak the language, don't have connections, jobs, whether they're going to
Hmm.
turn to crime.
Right.
So yeah, it was
And
it was really problematic.
it's the same. It's the same in Jamaica. Yeah. yeah, and in many cases, particularly in case of the Jamaican deportees, some and not all of them were involved in the drug trade, and for which the consumers were largely middle class white American, and they paid not just the ultimate price, but they paid multiple prices, whether it's prison sentence in the U.S. followed by being exiled or deported from the U.S. So
Mm.
they have really paid a very heavy price for catering to the habits of middle class white America.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that could be a whole other episode on the on the drug wars. So now that you've done all this research, all these interviews, I wonder how you think about your own return plans and how that has influenced, impacted, changed your or confirmed your own plans. You were just telling me that you just moved to Vancouver, even though you were very much in love with Toronto and dedicated a book to Toronto. So,
Yeah, yeah. I
is
was as
Yemen
surprised.
next?
I mean, honestly, I was as surprised as anyone that I made the move to Vancouver. I just didn't think that Yemen was a possibility just yet, given the ongoing war. And I did not, I mean, to be honest, I did not want to lose out on this great job that I was offered while the situation in Yemen is, hopefully, I don't know if it'll ever settle down, but I'd like to think it will settle down. I've never been more determined in my entire life to go back to Yemen than I am as I'm speaking to you, like right now. And as much as Vancouver is one of the most beautiful cities in North America and probably the world, I mean, I can see forest and ocean on my way to campus every day. Something I couldn't say about Toronto. I don't connect to it. I'm still new. I guess it may will take time, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be my home. I think once I retire, I'll probably leave. And once I retire and leave, I'll probably leave for Yemen.
Well,
I'm determined.
we'll check in with you then and find out.
Catch up
Maybe
with
do
me in
another
8 years from
episode, another book, and another episode.
now.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was delightful.
Thank you, Isabel. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for reading the book so carefully as well. I really appreciate that.
This was Kamal Al-Solaylee. His book, Return: Why We Go Back to Where We Come From, is published by Harper Collins in Canada. You can find it in bookstores and online in North America. It is not yet available elsewhere. However, you can always find a digital copy online. I will put links in the show notes and on the website. Remember that if you'd like to buy this or any other book that we recommend on the program, please use the links that I provide. Affiliate sales are a little drop in the bucket of funding Borderline, but it's always helpful. You will find the shop at borderlinepod.com, where you can also join to become a member. Thank you so much for all of you who already support. And as you're doing your Black Friday shopping or your Christmas shopping, please think of Borderline. Thank you. I'm your host, Isabel Hogal. Borderline is a One Lane Bridge production, and I will talk to you next week.